First of all, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for reading my paper. So I'll begin with my abstract. Quote, "Free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated." End quote, Elon Musk, the new owner of Twitter. Free speech is an essential element of American society. It has been the legacy of this nation and the pillars on which it was formed. Unfortunately, Americans have turned a blind eye to the lack of free speech in a specific area, that is social media. What many people fail to realize is that these platforms host speech in the same way that the government does, and act as a repressor of dialogue instead of a protector. This thesis is concerned with proposing the solution to the lack of free speech on social media. Congress should impose free speech protection legislation on all social media platforms for these three reasons. One, that Americans live in a pluralist system of free speech. Secondly, social media is analogous to a town square, and historically the only way to uphold free speech has been under a written constitution or a law. The first proof concludes that companies act in such a way as the government would be expected to act. They hold immense power to shut discussions down. The second proof explains how social media functions similarly to how public squares do, and highlights their importance as such. The third proof demonstrates how free speech can only be upheld under law. This issue matters to anyone who has a voice, that they might be able to use it in the most pervasive space of dialogue in the United States. It matters to society that important discussions and divisive topics can be discussed without the threat of censorship. Social media companies can no longer be allowed to have the immense power of being the arbitrators of speech. Free expression must prevail for the forward progression of American society.
What are rules set? Are they guidelines?
Yeah, I'm talking about guidelines.
Or are they terms of the service that is usually at the end of anything that you create an account for? You have to check the box that says, I agree.
Yeah, I'm using those two things interchangeably.
Okay.
I'm talking about the agreement that you have to sign in order to participate in the platform.
When using these platforms, when you sign up for social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, when you click on that, you're giving them consent.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
On their terms and their guidelines.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in your paper that those guidelines are sometimes vague and broad. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so I'm saying that there's a lot of times what they're listing as their rule set is can be very not specific at all, and it can often be applied in ways where it shouldn't be. Basically, it's too broad of a definition, so they're applying it in whatever places they choose to apply it.
So you're saying it's subjective?
Yeah, it's subjective.
You can get leans more for the private entity or the social media than it does the consumer or the user that's using it.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Does it favor, it seems to favor, implied in your paper, that it really is for social media. It's for their advantage to be broad and vague. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Because if they're broad and vague, hi Jonah.
Hi.
If they're broad and vague, then they can deem what is poor speech or based on those 6 or 7 different elements.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
You did a wonderful job in depicting how the new social media realms are the new public square of where dialogue is taking place. You did a great job with that.
Thank you.
In your thesis here, you had referenced how if we do not indicate, or if we do not bring about these laws against speech in social media squares, that it could impact the bottom line, maybe even just the livelihoods of individuals. Would you speak into, is it possible that having the liberty to say whatever you want, even if it were false, could also harm someone's livelihood? Could it be reversed the other way around?
Yes. So you mean like a user can harm the livelihood of another user?
Yes. So, for example, you could spread falsehoods about maybe a restaurant because I have freedom of speech. I can say whatever I want.
Mm-hmm.
Could that also? I mean, what I'm trying to say is it possible that if we keep people from being able to have their voice, for example, use the example of President Trump when he was in office, right? He could not have his voice, but then if that could harm someone's livelihood, if we were to allow someone to say whatever they wanted, could that also harm their livelihood?
Yes, I would say that's the case, but I would also say that probably does already happen on social media in its current state. Without the new law being in place, you can obviously say damaging things about people as long as it doesn't fall under the law that is already enforced, which is defamation. The reasons I listed in my paper. So yes, I wouldn't say that it would become more of a problem under a new law. I would say that already happens and that it's already taken care of appropriately.
Just to clarify, end users, who are they?
End users are just any person that uses the platform.
So it could be citizens, American citizens, It could be just public, all public, outside the United States.
It's just a technical term for the user,
Okay.
the individual using the platform.
And it sounds like you believe they need this protection?
Yes,
The protection to,
say what they'd like to say.
okay, so protection of free speech
Mhm.
within the guidelines that you stated in constitutional guidelines? Right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jonah, you made a great inclusive statement here. However, it should be clearly recognized that regardless of the different positions on the overall societal importance of social media platforms, users are actively disincluded from participation. This is not free speech. Such a thing does not currently exist on social media.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that you did a great job of both sides. No matter where someone lands on this issue, you did a great job of pulling both of them in with that statement.
Thank you.
What was maybe a compelling idea as you were preparing for this thesis that after doing the research, you felt like there was too many holes put in, and I had to kind of put it aside. Maybe you had a bullet ready to go, but then you thought, you know what? No, this can be refuted too easily.
Yeah, I have a good answer for this one. So I talked about in my refutation the public utility idea. That was actually the first thing I went with. I thought that the public utility was the solution, but then I realized there were so many extra things that come along with that classification that could be harmful, and I thought it was kind of a less straightforward way of dealing with the same problem, and I thought that there were easier avenues to this, which is why I changed it.
What do you think the underlining, what is fully at stake here? If you had to boil it down, what do you think is fully at stake with this proposed law?
At stake if it doesn't happen, I think it's a really big thing. So I talked a little bit about this, the progression of society, the health of our democracy. I think it's really important, and I kind of outlined that in the paper, that we're able to talk about controversial issues and important topics, and not have the fear of being censored for expressing those ideas. So I think it's really important, just generally, that everyone is able to speak freely.
Speaking about just that social media serves as a public square, you said that on page 10,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned that it's the most significant place of public discourse in the U.S.
Yeah.
I think most people would agree on that.
Mm-hmm.
But granted, social media is kind of a recent phenomenon.
Yeah,
You know
it
that.
is.
And it's ever changing, ever evolving. But there are other places, a public square, people can argue that's just as effective, like TV or news media outlets, other news media outlets, newspapers, blogs, vlogs, documentaries, editorials, all those.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say social media is different because, like you said, TV, the difference is that users are interacting with each other in real time and in a very real sense. And I'd also say that there's a very significant amount of Americans that do this, that participate. I think I said 72% of the public uses social media. And I think that's a very large number of people who are using that service for those things. And I think that's part of what sets it apart, is just the sheer amount.
You're proposing a law.
Yeah.
Am I correct? Okay. So how would you word this law that would regulate overseers of their platforms or regulate unfair practices found in these rules or these rules set?
Yeah. So what I said is I want essentially the First Amendment specifically to be applied. So that would mean almost complete and total free speech. I think I outlined that in my my first proof, and I did list I think there were 7 exceptions. So it isn't completely free in the sense that you can say absolutely whatever you want. There are some restrictions. There is some degree of moderation power that is granted to the platforms. Yeah, and so that's a little bit outside of what my research was. I didn't consider like how I would word the law or what exactly that would entail. Yeah.
So you don't really have a recommendation of enforcement?
Well, I think enforcement would just take place by the means that it already does. So, for example, the FBI gets involved in a lot of cases with social media. For example, if someone is posting illegal content, the FBI will go after they will either ask the platform to take it down themselves, or they themselves will go and delete the content. So I think that enforcement already essentially exists.
So following from that question and your answer, since it's a First Amendment law, the government would be the overriding kind of enforcer of this?
Yes, yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so on page 8 of your thesis it says, additionally, it should be recognized that the government cannot be trusted when it comes to what ideas its citizens can hear. So here's my question with that. If the government cannot be trusted, how can they oversee the implementation of the suggested laws? With the secondary question of, is it an endless stream of overseers of overseers of the overseers? Does that make sense?
Sort of. Yeah, I think it's pretty basic in its structure, and I think it's also pretty transparent. So if the law is out there that these platforms cannot censor speech of any kind outside of the Supreme Court precedents, then if that's the case, then it's out there for everyone to see. People can take people can take other people to court for defamation. I think the transparency is really important there. And I think that's does that sort of solve your answer your question?
So obviously we're living in a day now where the cyclical nature of the government, depending on which side seems to be ruling, is what seems to be championed, right? And so I'm just asking, is this potentially a rabbit hole that kind of doesn't really have an end because you've got to oversee the overseer, or another way we call it today is who's fact-checking the fact-checkers, right? Who's saying that this is a true threat? That's one of your 7.
Yeah.
Is it a true threat? Who's determining that? And so I just was wondering if that is something that had crossed your mind when we're talking about quote unquote untrustworthy organization.
I certainly think there's some risk of that. And I would also say that that's not something I went a little too deep into in my research. Yeah, so.
It's okay
Absolutely.
if you don't know. It's fine to say you don't know, because I think, so the Supreme Court has been approached on this for a millennium. I mean, it seems like it, but for decades basically, but not a millennium. And they're still defining what is offensive speech, what is free speech that is protected. But if you're using government as the enforcer, it may look like federal, depending on what laws are being broken online. It could be a state law. But essentially, some of the sightings that you've said already, it seems like the enforcer would be courts, so it would be judicial.
Yeah, that could be one route of enforcement.
Free speech is a hard thing. It really is. To regulate it under the complete definition of the Constitution. I don't mean to ask those questions to trip you up, but to really think through, how do you regulate free speech?
Yeah.
Because according to the First Amendment, free speech basically says that government cannot infringe, they can't pass laws that would infringe free speech.
Yeah.
But people would argue that this law would actually do just that. Do you have a response to that? Or?
No, I don't see how this law would infringe on free speech. The only thing that would be infringing on is the platform's ability to censor its users. So I don't think they have the right to do that. And I don't think they have a right. I don't think that falls under their right to free speech.
I think my colleague saying here, I can't remember your name, I'm sorry.
Vivian.
Vivian, is that, so we're all here for you, I think you know that. That when you're trying to make an argument, and we're saying that the First Amendment right is that the government won't infringe anyway on free speech, and then we're going to have a law to try to enforce that. It's the way it's perceived. And
Okay.
so to be able to articulate that, I think we know where you stand. It's more so we need a law that is making sure that the new court of discussion is also allowing free speech. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And I would say that it's very similar to the First Amendment. So the way that First Amendment protects free speech would be the same way that this new law would protect free speech.
Do you believe only the government can make a significant impact against this either prohibition or preventive free speech on media, on social media?
That it can make an impact on preventing free speech?
Well, I think you're using the government as passing this law, right?
Congress.
And do you think only the government can make that impact?
Okay.
Have you considered maybe there's something else that could make an impact?
Yeah, there are certainly different routes to the same solution. I think one that's really interesting, it just happened recently, so Elon Musk bought Twitter, and he's supposedly a free speech absolutist. So I think that it would definitely be a very good thing if he went through with what he said he's going to do. And I think that solves part of the problem, but not the entire issue, which is that there are many other platforms that still do not have freedom of speech and still need it.
Do you think maybe the law would lend itself, that you're thinking of, maybe has to do more with unfair practices versus just free speech altogether? Have you considered that maybe? Because social media has their thing.
You mean like their bias, or?
Yeah, that's intermingled with that.
Sorry, can you ask the question again?
Okay,
I don't quite understand.
The government's not the only one that can hold social media accountable. Have you considered other things other than the law? This is going outside of that, like consumers can protest, for example.
I think that's certainly true. I don't think that people are really on board with that. I think it'd be very hard to gather a lot of people to protest free speech on social media, because I think a lot of people don't care, and that's why there's still people using Twitter and Facebook. But yeah, I definitely want to explore that a little more. I think that's definitely true.
After reading your paper, it was really fun for me. It opened up a whole can of worms for me about free speech because of all the most recent news has been, whether it's Elon Musk buying Twitter for 44 million.
Billion.
And that just went through on Monday.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an ever-changing thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's also another lawsuit case. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's PragerU versus Google YouTube.
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You might want to look into that. But I'm going to tell you what they're fighting about. They are talking about free speech, but I want you to see if I can get a response from you about this, and maybe it could factor into your wording of your law, proposed law. So, Google claims to be a public forum for free expression.
Yeah.
But they censor groups that discriminate against, and therefore, they're more like a publisher than a public forum.
Yeah.
They can editorialize, they have this editorial control over what's the content of that. And therefore, it curbs free speech. Doesn't necessarily take away, but it curbs, it suspends. Sometimes, in some cases, they terminate if they don't like something. That's you've mentioned that in your paper.
Yeah.
If there is a public forum, then it would be a violation of First Amendment, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if maybe it's not that. That's the other thing, because the plaintiff is arguing that it's more of a breach of contract as well as consumer fraud, which is already regulated. So why would you need another law when you're dealing with censorship?
Another law, like
the law that you're proposing. Why would you just in light of this case, because this case is pretty new also. So it's actually in front of the Ninth Circuit Court, and it's also under a lower court too.
Yeah. So did Google censor these people? Is that what happened? Okay.
Selectively.
Yeah.
They changed the algorithm.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So under this law, that wouldn't happen. That whole thing wouldn't have even been brought to fruition. That I don't think that kind of thing would exist anymore. Had this passed.
So the only thing is, would you be challenging the algorithm that Google and YouTube has, or their guidelines, or like a combination of that?
I think this targets more specifically their guidelines, and I think social media algorithms are also a big issue, and I think they can also inhibit free speech. I didn't explore that in my paper because of the page limits, but I think that'd be another really interesting thing to get into.
Understand that if you touch those things, those are proprietary. There are other laws that protect that too. So would you consider or revisit how you would word that law? Just think about it and think, is it really, something that the government can put out a law that really regulates? And if it does, it kind of opens this can of worms, right? Like, do you touch this private entity? Do you touch, it's, I mean, I can already think of all the arguments that the plaintiff would have, like just that alone.
Yeah.
They would think maybe the guidelines, that's their freedom of expression too, and you as a user agreed to that.
Yeah, so that's the argument, that these private companies are private and they should be able to operate in whichever way they choose to operate. You agree to their terms, you have to follow their terms. I think that I sort of addressed this in the paper. I don't think that they should have the right to do that if they continue to operate in the way that they do, and they continue to tout themselves as public services. as free and open. But I also said in my paper that there are exceptions to this. There are some private companies which I would not want this to apply to, some social media platforms that shouldn't be affected. And those are some with relatively basic barriers of entry and that target specific demographics.
I had a question with that point. Can you give an example of one of those that have a basic barrier
Sure.
of entry?
Yeah, like maybe say like a dating site, something like that. Some social media platform. I know I didn't see too many of these in my research, but I do know they exist. That have their own specific like niches, and requirements that need to be met in order for you to sign up. Yeah. The difference is that they don't tout themselves as public and open and free.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Because people would argue that those dating sites have fraudulent things, and there was a breach of contract with people, but you can't really go there, right? So you are distinguishing a private, there's some, well, maybe I shouldn't go there. There's 83 million followers on Twitter. I just looked that up last night. And I don't know, the last question I asked about enforcement, that's a difficult thing to do. I asked you about how it would be enforced, and it's still a little bit in the works, right?
Yeah.
But we live in a litigious society, like this is only a few lawsuit cases and things that are pending and ever changing. Could this law really have teeth? And really provide the, free speech that we all feel like we are entitled to as Americans?
Yeah, I think it would. I think that I talk about it fairly basically. I don't go into it like you said. It's really just about the idea that, and again, the enforcement is not really something I talked about, but the idea that these companies, it would be a very basic definition. You cannot moderate anything. You can't censor anything that isn't in conjunction with the Supreme Court precedents. So what are already the outliers in free speech in America, just under the government, which is defamation, true threats, that kind of thing. So it's really just about the idea.
It's funny, when I was reading this, I was chomping at the bit, like, when is he going to mention social media as public utility? And it doesn't come until page 12.
Yeah.
And I was like, really? And I'm glad that you mentioned that you were going to start on that at first, but then you put it on later. And I would have done the same thing because it's really, social media as a public utility, that's a very controversial theory.
Yeah, it is.
Do you agree?
Yeah, it's very controversial.
And it postulates that social media network sites are essentially a public square, and therefore it should be regulated. But people who are true free speechers, including Elon Musk, who's a libertarian, he would have said, no, can't regulate that. It would infringe on everyone's free speech. But if it is a public utility, you'd have to really argue strong. Is that what stopped you from going there? I didn't look into it as far as the fact that it didn't meet the very basic second requirement. So I'm pretty sure. Good.
Yeah. So the two requirements are that it has to have a high barrier of entry, and I did lend some credence to that. Like I think that could very well be the case. So that could definitely be argued, but I don't think it could be argued at all that any one of these specific platforms has a monopoly in the social media space.
I'd agree.
So I didn't go any further than that. That just stopped me. I just thought that doesn't make the idea legitimate anymore. It has to meet those two basic requirements at the very least.
Very good. Because is it really a public utility? Because I think gas, water.
Yes.
Gas, water, utilities, those are public utility. but this assumes that having a monopoly or power or broad social influence is some kind of public utility. And yet there are people who they just don't use it, or as you say, they don't really care.
It's true.
Maybe the trolls on there might care, but
Yeah.
in general, they're like,
Right.
You have 8.5 minutes left.
Jonah, I feel you did a great job on expressing how the public forum was the way that people got their information. And now with this social media is now the new public forum. And if that is being censored, then they're not getting all of the information. And I felt like you did a great job with pointing that out, because this is what you said, the public square has shown to be so important to social health, and it must be recognized in its new forms today and protected adequately. And so I think you did a really, really good job with painting those two as together. This is our new public forum.
Right.
And there are other avenues, as even been mentioned, but this is a lot of the main forum. So great job.
Thank you.
We too had a robust discussion in our home the last 2 days with this. And me being a preacher of the gospel and an advocate for free speech, I couldn't help but taking this to a much further degree of where our country's going, the direction that our country's going, when the government, and that's why I kind of get fearful of the government being the one that's overseeing it, when the government starts changing what these 6 exemptions are, like where me being a preacher of the gospel, now all of a sudden they're going to deem me as a threat to society. And so this really, really hit home for me, and I want to thank you for your time put into it.
Appreciate it. Yes, I would also like to say about those exceptions. The Supreme Court has historically been very picky as to add to them or to take away from them. So I think there is some trust there that it will stay that way. Those exceptions will not be added to, at least in the near future.
I guess just the definition of what a true threat is,
right?
When it goes into the court, because I say there's, one way to heaven, you're that kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
But it brought great discussion.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you a hard one. And this is my last one.
Sure.
I promise. And this deals with the relevance of your paper. You mentioned on page 3, our First Amendment rights, the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech. But as I mentioned before, First Amendment primarily protects the right of free speech against government interference.
Yes.
Congress shall not make any law abridging the freedom of speech. So First Amendment seems to apply only to governmental action.
It does.
And not behavior by private employers, private companies, or private non-government individuals, unless, and there's a case about this, unless they acted in concert with government actors. And therefore, the First Amendment right does not apply to private companies or individual conduct.
Yes.
Which is Twitter, Google, all that.
Yeah, exactly.
What's your response?
That's true, and that's the way that they operate now, is the First Amendment. I mentioned this also here, that the First Amendment doesn't apply to these platforms simply because the moderators are not part of the government. So the users don't have protection from these private entities. They only have protection from the government. And that's the way it operates today. And I think that needs to change.
What was the most valuable thing you took away from this study?
I learned a lot about free speech. I thought that was great. I loved researching this whole thing. Just having general knowledge, more knowledge of what that means and how important it is, I think that's very valuable.
Just what she said about applying the government. Doesn't the government have their hand in all these big tech companies that are censoring things? Don't they influence what they censor? So does it apply to them or not?
No, just because they're not classified as part of the government. That's the whole idea of the public utility, is that if these companies were considered public utilities, then the First Amendment would directly apply to these platforms.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
I may have missed this. What is not allowed to be said in the First Amendment?
So nothing in the First Amendment itself. It's Supreme Court precedent. What they count as the exceptions of free speech. They're technically classified as lower speech. Let me see if I can find it. I think it's like 7. Here it is. A few notable exceptions that the Supreme Court has held to: classifying a small minority of specific speech as being lower, such as defamation, true threats, fighting words, child abuse imagery, advertising, and obscenity. So that's it.
Have you researched anything about content moderation practices?
No.
Okay,
I didn't.
then I won't ask that question. What would you do differently now that you've done this? It's in your thesis.
Maybe I would focus on a little more of the specifics. So I could have focused completely on the law itself rather than just a general idea of it. So I could go through like the wording of that, the enforcement like you're talking about. That's just something extra. That's not necessarily something I do differently. Yeah.
Would you also state harms too, and just kind of list them? If
Yeah,
you went that route?
yeah, I
Because
would.
that would be consistent with what we've been doing
Yeah.
throughout Challenge.
I definitely would have liked to do that.
Are you going to be doing any kind of speech or debate in the near future?
Probably.
If you do, this is a recurring thing.
Yeah, right.
So I feel like you have like at least a really good foundation to bounce off of and build on. So keep building that knowledge. It will only make your argument stronger and your position.
What are you classifying as social media?
I kind of talked about this. So Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, search engines that resolve domain names. And I said the law applies to, the law applies to mostly the services that tout themselves as being open and free to the public, no barrier of entry, anyone can use it, that sort of thing.
How about like Discord or Reddit?
Not Discord. Discord isn't necessarily social media. It's more of like a messaging app, I would say. And then Reddit, I think it'd apply to Reddit, yeah. Because it's open, it's free.
Thank you, Jonah.
Yeah.
You took